When you haven't built a railway in 100 years, things change. For its new high-speed train, Britain needs a whole new line. 100+ kilometres of headaches.
It was like, what? They want us to do what? By when? For how much?
More than 150 bridges to be built.
It was like threading the needle through that space.
More than 20 kilometres of tunnels to be dug.
Tunnellers are extremely superstitious people.
And a Victorian jewel to be saved. The tracks will lead to a macabre discovery.
We were expecting a couple of bodies.
Some 7,000 bodies uncovered.
And to Olympic gold.
High Speed 1 is much more than a railway.
Wow!
That's what 300 kilometres an hour looks like.
(1996). In Britain, something strange happens when the new high-speed Eurostar emerges from the Channel Tunnel. It slows down. From Paris to the Channel, the train flies.
We'll be travelling at 300 kilometres per hour, which is our normal speed.
But when it hits Britain, it hits the brakes. 2/3 of its speed gone. On the British side, the Eurostar shares track with 20th century trains moving at 19th century speeds. Britain needs a whole new railway. 109 kilometres from the Channel to London. High Speed 1 will become one of the largest engineering projects in British history. It will take 12 years, employ 10,000 workers, and cost almost £7 billion, more than the entire budget of Kenya. The last time the British built a railway, Victoria was queen. And one of the route's biggest challenges is a Victorian relic. High Speed 1's London terminus. St Pancras Station is one of the most historic buildings in England. A palace of iron, brick and glass. When completed in 1868, this was the world's largest single-span roof. The acme of Victorian engineering.
This building's absolutely magic for me. That the Victorians could achieve this without all the computer power we've got, could achieve spans that they have. The efficiency, actually, when we analysed it, this structure achieved was quite fantastic.
But after the Victorians, it went to pot. Bombed in both world wars, poorly repaired, and facing the wrecking ball. In 1996, High Speed 1 acquires the building, and the team takes their first look inside.
I guess I was quite sceptical when suggestions were made about making this a destination station.
Behind its facade, St Pancras is darkness and dampness, diesel fumes and drug needles. Every hour, fewer than half a dozen trains arrive. Planners envision more than 30 trains. And something else. They dream of St Pancras as the next London attraction.
And I suppose the big question we had at the time was, can we possibly change this awful space from a liability into a fantastic asset?
At the other end of the line, groundbreaking begins, and engineers wrestle with their own problem: the risk of cave-ins. Mike Glover will work on High Speed 1 from beginning to end.
Every project has a key area of risk. And for the first stage of the railway, the North Downs Tunnel was the key area of risk.
The North Downs is a raft of hills in southeast England, the ripples from the creation of the Alps. Hills pose a challenge to rails.
Railways are different from highways in the sense that highways can hug the topography much more than railways can. And as a consequence, with high-speed railways, you have more tunnelling and more bridges to deal with than you would otherwise.
At Bluebell Hill, they have to tunnel through 3.5 kilometres of chalk.
The problem with the chalk, particularly in this area, is that it has vertical faults and weathering planes in it.
Outwardly, chalk looks uniform, but running through it are fault lines, where two masses of chalk have split. When water enters, it further weakens the fault zone. Chalk is also porous, so it can hold tons of water. Hit a fault, and the tunnel could cave in and flood. Double disaster. Chalk's not the only problem. Bluebell Hill is an ancient woodland, and some of its oldest trees lie in the path of the tracks.
When you've got a 100-year-old oak or beech tree, you don't just dig it up and move it. You can't. But what you can do is you can protect the most valuable part of ancient woodland, which is its soil.
They move acres of soil from Bluebell Hill. Into the soil, they'll transplant young trees using a special machine. Each blade exerts 25 tons of force. Typical load, 6 tons. More trees will be planted up and down the whole railway. In all, they plant a mega-forest. $1.2 million trees. The young trees are growing faster than normal, thanks to old soil.
But it just shows the degree of planning that we put into the pre-construction phases to protect the ecology of the route.
At Bluebell Hill, they're ready to tunnel. But how strong is the chalk? To find out, crews drill boreholes into the chalk, probing for planes of failure. But the planes are so narrow, they could lie between the boreholes.
So unless our boreholes actually went through one of those, we would have missed it. So what we did during the construction of the tunnel, we actually do pilot drillings ahead of the hole to test what the materials are ahead of us.
If they hit a failure plane, they'll use giant screws called rock bolts to secure the chalk.
In the event, the quality of the chalk that we found, with 1 or 2 weak areas, proved to be of a higher quality than we could reasonably have expected. And that did contribute to us completing this tunnel 6 months ahead of programme and £5 million under budget.
Even despite North Downs' size, twice as wide as other tunnels on High Speed 1. The reason is speed and pressure. Trains enter the south end of the tunnel at 300 kilometers an hour, the maximum speed on the line. In a normal tunnel, such high speed would build up high pressure.
And this comes about really by the front of the train pushing air in front of it. And because the tunnel is smaller, it pressurizes, compresses the air, and you get the consequence of ear popping, for example, if the pressure is not relieved.
To relieve the pressure, engineers normally sink ventilation shafts.
In the North Downs Tunnel, that wasn't possible. As you can see in the rock mass behind me, we've got many hundreds of meters of material, and so a shaft was not practical. But what we do is we create a larger diameter to the tunnel, so that as the train comes into the tunnel, the pressure is dissipated.
Wow! That's what 300 kilometers an hour looks like.
Down the line, the railway of tomorrow yields a surprise from the past. Beneath the route of High Speed 1 lies more than rock. 2,000 years of history is buried here. The Victorians and Elizabethans, the Anglo-Saxons and Romans, and the tribes who lived here before history began. Someone has to safeguard England's heritage.
The archaeologists in many ways were the front line for construction, preparing the route so that construction wasn't delayed. And in fact, at one point when construction officially started, there were more archaeologists on site than construction workers.
Where Ebbsfleet Station now stands, they hit pay dirt.
A Roman settlement, a Roman villa, Anglo-Saxon watermill and an Anglo-Saxon cemetery.
And a big surprise.
We didn't plan for it. It was found when the construction workers were busy preparing for a small side road that brings you into the station here. And we had an archaeologist observing that activity, and he phoned me up to say that he thought he'd found part of an elephant. And as you can imagine, we were absolutely stunned, because this is an internationally important discovery.
A 400,000-year-old elephant is rare, anywhere.
That's during the Paleolithic period in the UK, and it's an elephant, not a mammoth. It would have been much warmer in the landscape at the time, so it didn't need fur of a mammoth. And this whole area would have been a completely different landscape than the one we see today. We think it got stuck in the mud or the edge of a small lake. And what's particularly interesting is that we found pieces of worked flint, that's flint that has been made by humans, in and around the skeleton and also on the bank of the bog or the lake. And therefore we know that our ancestors were in and around the elephant. Whether or not the elephant had died and they were butchering it, we're really not very sure. But to have human interaction with this beast is just amazing.
13 kilometers away, crews inching towards Ebbsfleet hit a worst-case scenario. A mega disaster. To build a bridge for the Eurostar across the River Medway will take the world's longest high-speed rail span, 1.3 kilometers long. So long, the builders have to weigh the worst that could happen. A fully loaded train travelling at full speed, hitting the brakes. The stress could topple the bridge.
And to overcome that, the column supports that you see on the bridge have to be designed to take the horizontal forces from those braking down to the foundations without the column undergoing any undue deformation.
The solution comes from the alphabet. By design, the V-shaped supports carry stress down to the concrete foundations, sunk firmly into bedrock. Nothing can rattle this bridge. But as usual, solve one problem, another appears. To erect the bridge itself would take a forest of scaffolds.
We were desperately trying to avoid unsafe practices And the use of large extents of scaffolding and temporary works, it does lead to an increase in accidents.
In fact, 4 workers will die during the construction of the railway, including one who falls from a scaffold.
So we looked for techniques whereby we could avoid that.
They find a solution called push launch.
Simply describe the push launch technique. Imagine that my fingers are columns which have been already constructed in the landscape. And then over here I construct a concrete segment. And then I push the segment out onto the first column. And then I cast another segment behind that one and I push that forward. And then I cast another segment and I push that forward.
Each segment is 40 meters long and weighs 1,000 tons. So heavy that as it slides across, the friction could push the columns over.
This is a column, and we want the bridge deck to move across it without pushing the column. And to do that, we use Teflon-coated pads, which sit on top of the column, which allow the bridge to move across with minimum of friction.
The centre span itself is erected by another method, one that spares them the money, time and risk of using towers and cables. It's called balanced cantilever construction. From the 2 central piers, workers will build outward. They work in balance, 1 segment at a time.
And so the bridge then cantilevers out, 1 segment at a time, balancing on each side. So it's a balancing trick. The aspect which I think is most rewarding is its visual appearance. It is the signature structure of the whole of the railway. And it's the sort of bridge that if you put it on a stamp, it's immediately recognisable as the emblem of the Channel Tunnel Rail Link project.
While crews build bridges and dig tunnels, others are working at the end of the line in London, where the other emblem of High Speed 1 faces its makeover.
The whole project is a massive achievement. But if I have to pick out one aspect of it which sticks in the mind more than anything else, it has to be St Pancras. Because of the challenges weren't just engineering. They were a question of actually thinking about how people would use the space, how it functioned.
Engineer Ailey McAdam is tapped to transform St Pancras Station from has-been to must-see.
Wow, we got the opportunity to turn what is a beautiful building. It was beautiful, but it was old, and there was a lot of repair that was required. It was dark and dingy and wet in some places, but clearly the potential was there. I think my feeling was the opportunity to change this building into something that is going to live for another 150 years. Although that's countered with, I knew what the programme was at that time, I knew what the budget was, and it was like, what? They want us to do what? By when? For how much?
St Pancras will actually become 4 stations in one. The High Speed 1 terminus for Eurostar, a high-speed commuter link to southeast England, a new station on the London Underground, and a rail link to the region north of London.
But then there wasn't room to get all of the domestic train services into the original train station because we now have 13 platforms in total.
There isn't even room for the Eurostars, twice as long as other trains. They build an extension the length of 5 football fields. In the old terminal, work begins on the centrepiece of the station, the roof. After it was bombed in the World Wars, the glass was replaced with solid panels. But Londoners like their light.
We've been able to reasonably faithfully recreate what the original designer, William Barlow, had conceived for the roof, which was this cathedral, really, of light coming into a fantastic operating station.
And I like to think we've been true to Barlow's original design. I like to think he's looking down at us now and saying, OK, those guys made me proud.
But down below, they hit a brick wall. As charming as a dungeon, the windowless lower level was once used to store beer barrels.
They used to bring the passengers in during the daytime and Midlands Burton beer at night time and then distribute it into London.
The dilemma was that this space was not seen to be usable, and I felt that that was a complete waste of an asset. And as a consequence, spent a little bit of time, in fact quite a lot of time, thinking about how we could use the space, the beer cellar.
The answer is heavenly. Cut open the ceiling and let there be light.
What it's done is light up the whole station. You now get light streaming down through the roof, down through the light wells, down into the undercroft. It's fantastic.
What was once a liability is now an asset. Yet once again, solve one problem, create another.
Finding a solution to the space below the platforms wasn't quite as straightforward as we had hoped. The famous arch of the station, in its day, was the largest clear span roof in the world. Any arch structure wants to try and spread, and to avoid that spread, the platform deck had provided the tie structure.
Without the ties, the arch wants to thrust outwards. So we had to replace the ties with a concrete slab, which you see in front of you.
The slab not only holds the arch together, it bears the weight of the extra-long Eurostars. But still, another problem. The platform rests on more than 700 original cast-iron columns, as sturdy as ever. But the old wrought iron beams above them can't bear the new load.
Directly you put that kind of load onto it, it will essentially snap like a carrot.
And we overcame that with what is perhaps the cleverest little detail on the project.
Few visitors will ever notice it. A round bearing is inserted atop each column and below each beam. 4 struts made of a high-strength steel alloy bracket each beam. The struts divert the load of the platform from the bearing and onto the column, bypassing the beam.
Very simple device, very easily installed, and it meant that we did not have to touch the actual historic structure by welding things onto it or gluing things onto it.
So far, they've made use of space. Now to make time. To stay on schedule, they have to work on 3 levels at once.
So we actually had to be doing the work on the roof at the same time as we were rebuilding and restoring the platform level, at the same time as we were cleaning and repairing the undercroft. So to make it possible, we actually had 3 complete workforces working simultaneously.
Which has obviously its construction phasing challenges and also its safety challenges when you've got guys working on 3 levels.
There are some rails running along which had been the original rails for a cleaning gantry. And we used those and we hung a scaffold with a complete soffit to that scaffold, and that was crucial because safety was very important to us, and we didn't want the possibility of any workman either himself falling or dropping tools onto workmen at this level.
Or injuring passengers. St Pancras could be renovated in half the time if they could shut it down. But local trains come and go, day and night.
We at times had 2,500 construction workers, we had commuters, and we didn't have a single fatality, and we had very, very few serious accidents. So that was a fantastic achievement.
While St Pancras gets a mega facelift, engineers down the line hit a mega hurdle. Near the River Thames, High Speed 1 will cross the Queen Elizabeth II Bridge and the M25 motorway, one of Britain's busiest highways. Here's the tricky part. Construction must pass under the bridge and over the road without stopping traffic. Engineers again turn to push launch.
And if you were to take time-lapse photography, you would see the bridge literally creeping out across the landscape. It was like threading the needle through that space, and could not have been done by any other construction technique without closing the motorways.
"35 kilometers from completion, High Speed 1 reaches an obstacle it can't bridge or bypass.
The Thames Tunnel represented the largest single risk on the whole of the project.
The risks: cave-in, flooding, and failure. The Thames Tunnel is actually two tunnels side by side, each 7 meters across and more than 2 kilometers long. And so deep, you could stand a 10-story building underwater. Digging mega tunnels takes a mega machine. A tunnel boring machine, or TBM. Technology draped in mystique.
Tunnelers are probably similar to mariners in their superstitions. All the TBMs have to have a female name, and it's considered very unlucky to ever change the name.
Hayden Davis will help build the London tunnels, and this is his baby.
This is a typical example of a London tunnels machine. This is the working end, this is the cutter head.
The teeth are made of a hardened steel alloy, and the entire head is attached to a sealed chamber called a plenum. The only time you'll ever see it working is when it finishes. Here's what goes on out of sight. As the teeth scour the rock, the debris falls into the plenum. From the plenum, debris flows out via a giant corkscrew called an Archimedes screw. The debris moves along conveyor belts to the end of the tunnel. The entire machine is as long as a football field. Inching the TBM forward are 29 hydraulic rams.
As the cutter head is going round, cutting the ground, these rams act on the last ring built, shove the whole thing forward, including all this backup equipment, until there's enough space here to build another ring, which is 1.5 meters wide.
Each ring is formed of 10 precast segments brought by train from the head of the tunnel.
Then this red piece here comes into play, and this is called the segment erector.
Even concrete segments have to be handled gently. Chipping opens channels for water. The segment erector uses vacuum suction.
It picks up the individual segments for the ring, places them in position, and the miners bolt them together. And once the ring is complete, the rams can then move against the last ring built and start the cycle all over again.
Every minute, the machine normally moves forward about the length of a finger, 100 millimeters.
100 millimeters a minute doesn't sound a lot, but when these machines are working 24/7, on a good day, they can build over 50 meters of tunnel.
Like other tunnellers on the route, they run into a familiar hazard: chalk.
We knew that it had deep fissures in it, and we knew that those fissures would be containing water.
40 metres below the Thames, the pressure on the cutter head is 4 times the pressure on the surface. If water breaches the cutter head, it could flood the TBM and drown the crew.
On a previous tunnel project, I've been in the tunnel when the lining was breached. I can only compare it probably to a submarine being depth charged.
To counteract the pressure, the plenum behind the cutter head is equally pressurized. It's called an earth pressure balance system.
And what happens with the earth pressure balancing is that if there was a sudden inflow of water during the tunnel operation, the pressurization in the plenum would respond and balance out the pressure.
Thanks to the pressurized plenum, crews bore ahead without a single breach. After 15 months, the TBMs emerge from beneath the Thames. By foreseeing trouble and heading it off, they've jumped ahead of schedule. But more tunnelling lies ahead, as daunting as the Thames, beneath the streets of London. Digging a railway under a metropolis gives architecture the jitters.
When you excavate a hole in the ground, it's almost inevitable that you'll get settlement at the surface. The solution we adopted to try and reduce the number of buildings we went under was to put it wherever possible under an existing busy live railway. That brought its own issues because any mishaps in the tunnelling under the railway could have been disastrous.
And we had agreed with the underground that we would only tunnel as long as the movements were within very, very strict and limited dimensions.
The TBM's earth pressure balancing system is designed to keep the ground over the tunnel from settling. Even settlement, the thickness of a toenail, could cost a fortune.
Indeed, at Highbury Station, we had a settlement limit of 1 millimetre. If we'd have exceeded that, the whole station would close down. Cost of £25 million a week.
And that was very anxious moments, because the London Underground could have closed our operation down, could have stopped the project.
6 TBMs in all are burrowing. 2 from the East End and 2 pairs from Stratford. Other crews dig ventilation shafts to dissipate pressure when trains race through the tunnel. The shafts can also be used in an emergency.
To allow the emergency services to get to a failed train in a reasonable time frame, the ventilation shafts had to be located at a sensible distance apart, and that distance was seen to be 3 kilometres.
Crews are working miles apart, yet all the tunnels and shafts must align within millimetres.
Very, very small tolerances because the actual train, being high speed, can't deviate in line or level. Some very accurate surveying needs to happen. On the tunnel rail link, it's so long that you have to take account of the Earth's surface in the surveying.
Such precise surveying couldn't happen without lasers and GPS. Long before trains start to run, the ventilation shafts play a crucial role when the TBMs hit flint.
It's a very hard and very abrasive material. It's been known to completely destroy cutter heads within as little as 200 metres of driving a tunnel.
And so therefore we had to design the head of the tunnel boring machine to be able to crunch through flints and to turn them into smaller parts that we could then take through our slurry machine.
They modify the cutter head with nearly 50 cutter discs, each a ton of hardened steel. They exert so much pressure they shatter flint. Yet even steel discs wear out.
When a tunnel boring machine arrived at a ventilation shaft position, the cutting blades were inspected and, where necessary, replaced. And as a consequence, the tunnel boring machines were capable of completing the whole tunnel from one end to the other without major breakdowns or refurbishments.
I think probably the only major urban tunnelling scheme in the UK in my lifetime that's come in on time and budget.
An enormous success story.
In the heart of London, another success story emerges from a big hole. A maintenance depot for Eurostar trains called the Stratford Box. It lies along the London tunnels between the Thames on the east and St Pancras on the west. The ground is so waterlogged it could flood the depot. Engineers have two choices.
We could either make the thickness of the base slab very, very, very thick so it stayed in the ground, or you could do what we decided to do, which was to pump.
Underground pumps drain enough water every day to overflow an Olympic swimming pool.
Interesting enough, the water is of such a quality that we have then used that and we give that to the Water Authority for London.
When complete, Stratford Box is 55 metres wide and more than 1 kilometre long.
And such a large box gave us the opportunity to actually say, well, we think we should have a station in this location. The introduction of this station, little did we realise, would actually be the genesis of the Olympics coming to London.
A stone's throw from Stratford Box is a floodplain with 100 empty acres. Using dirt from the box and the London tunnels, engineers raised the land 7 metres above the plain. A perfect site for an Olympic park. London has already put in its bid for the 2012 Games to the International Olympic Committee, the IOC. To win the bid, London has to prove it can move millions of fans speedily and easily, and High Speed 1 holds the answer. Shuttles could whiz fans from St Pancras and Ebbsfleet to the Olympic Park at Stratford along the new High Speed 1 route in a matter of minutes.
We were very fortunate in timing that the IOC were coming to London 2 or 3 weeks just before we were about to lay track in the tunnel between Stratford and here at St Pancras.
Holden takes the committee members from Stratford to St Pancras in a fleet of Land Rovers, through the same tunnel where high-speed shuttles will run.
I think that probably helped considerably for London to be awarded the Olympics, to show what a quick connection there was from this part of London to St Pancras.
After the Games, the Olympic site will house a new school, more than 3,000 homes, and one of the largest urban parks in Europe. And that's just for starters.
High Speed 1 is much more than a railway and about getting people from A to B.
It's about bringing dead neighbourhoods back to life.
To begin with, regeneration wasn't viewed as being particularly important, but in my opinion, it's the most important aspect of this railway.
Around here, particularly to the east and to the north of here, was about 67 acres of disused railway land that hadn't been used by the public forever. The whole area was very downbeat and very depressed, and the local people were fed up with it. They wanted change.
In all, almost 200 acres of blight will disappear.
Stratford City and King's Cross Central are the two biggest active development sites in London, and they're both enabled by High Speed 1. They wouldn't be happening if it wasn't for the railway.
As the tracks creep towards St Pancras, a new engineer climbs aboard. Dave Poynton spent half his career working on the Channel Tunnel. Midway through 2005, Rob Holden calls him out of retirement.
Thinking there might be a few days of interesting work, it was something of a surprise when he said, "No, we'd like you to take over and finish the railway." And how could I possibly refuse the opportunity to be there when the last spike went in the rail of a project linking London and Paris I'd started almost 20 years before. There was still a lot of work to do.
Setting ties, laying track, running power lines. They move gas pipes serving half of London without once interrupting service. Near St Pancras, they sink foundation piles within 2 meters of subway tracks, a feat no one had ever done.
And we managed to convince London Underground to let us get on with that work whilst they still had trains running through their tubes.
But along their own tracks, they hit a snag.
Through the trees behind me is the historic parish church of St Pancras. And in the Victorian times, associated with that church was a large burial ground, extending right as far as pretty much where we are standing now. And what the Victorians had to do to build the original station was dig a big trench right the way through that old cemetery.
Archaeologists know the bodies were reburied nearby, but how many and just where?
And pretty much right below where I'm standing now, we came across thousands of bodies.
In actual fact, it was some 7,000 bodies that were uncovered.
We were expecting a couple of bodies because we were excavating right close to a churchyard, but certainly not 7,000.
It takes several months to remove and record the bodies. For once, progress yields to history. In the heart of London, another Victorian corpse is about to be resurrected. At St Pancras Station, the renovation reaches the last stage, the cosmetic phase. Beauty here is more than skin deep, because they're not just creating a place to come and go. It's a place to stop and gaze.
In my opinion, not only the big grand ideas matter, but detail also matters. So we put a lot of energy into getting details right.
After scraping off decades of paint and discovering the original colour, they repaint the station Barlow blue. Hundreds of new doors with Victorian brasswork. Thousands of bricks. 160,000 slate tiles. And a new timepiece 5 meters wide. All facsimiles of the originals, as required by English heritage law.
We had to use the same stone that they used 150 years ago from the same quarry. We had to use the same clay. We had to use the same mortar. In fact, we tested the mortar on the existing station, did a chemical analysis of it, and then reconstituted them and used that to build the new parts of the station.
We've often been asked, why was the station worth preserving? I personally like to think, standing here now, the answer is self-evident.
November 2007. At St Pancras International, High Speed 1 welcomes its first passengers.
This is the first new railway constructed in this country for over 100 years. It puts us on a par with what's been achieved in France and Germany with high-speed lines. And it's a mega project, a project which has been delivered on time and within budget.
For those who use it, High Speed 1 is all about time. London to Paris in about the time it takes to watch a movie. The builders of High Speed 1 have succeeded so well, they draw admirers who aren't going anywhere.
Previously, you could only get in any way near a train by being a passenger and being on the train. But now you can see the Eurostars close up, even if you're a schoolboy or schoolgirl and you're not going anywhere near Paris today, and you can dream about going to Paris tomorrow or next year.
As Bogart said to Bacall, we'll always have Paris. Now, we'll get there a lot faster.